All right, so today we're going to be going over another Interp lesson. Last time we went over and decided actually how you can find a piece that works for you, but now we're going to go and start getting that piece ready for you because within Interp, obviously, if you're doing memorized, you only have 10 minutes, and if you're doing book Interp, maybe even less with only 8. There's only so much time and only so much that we can actually put into our pieces. If you're even just doing a script, they can be upwards of 30 to 40 pages for small play scripts, which is a lot still. You're still gonna have to cut down a good chunk of text to be able to perform that in your allotted time. But even more so, if you're doing a book or a movie, you're gonna have to cut so much. If you think about movies, even if we're generous and we say it's an hour and a half, which is a relatively short movie, that's still 9 times what we can do. So very clearly, a lot of things are going to have to go. And it's going to be a hard process because there are so many things that we need to cut down while still making sure that we can keep our piece funny and have everything we need to tell the story and so on and so forth. So cutting is by far one of the most important parts of the Interp process because this is both where you can start to really connect with your piece and make it your own, and also where you can start planting the seeds for what you're going to do to make it actually entertaining. We talked about last time how picking a piece, you shouldn't focus solely on humor because you can start being having your own individuality with it and inserting humor or drama yourself. This is where we can start to do that because you can set yourself up for jokes that you can make whenever you get into the actual acting part of it, or even rearrange words a little bit to make it super fun and interesting. Before we even get into the actual process of cutting, it's important to note the rules of cutting, which generally is just that you cannot add words. You can rearrange words to form different meanings as long as you keep the intent behind those words. And you can even technically you can add words to some extent, but only for transition purposes. But you can't just go through and add whatever words you want. So generally, we're going to be cutting, and we can insert innuendos that weren't intended before, or whatever jokes we might need. But as long as we're not inserting words and drastically just basically writing our own script by rearranging words, then you are compliant with the rules. So those are the basic things that we just need to keep note of before we actually go into cutting, because obviously if you start breaking a bunch of rules, then you're going to be in trouble. Also, it is my personal opinion that although it takes a lot of time, depending on how long your piece is, if you can, I would go through and convert it to a digital format. Personally, what I did this year for the first time ever was a PDF scanner, which would then convert it into a copy and paste text, which was definitely imperfect. I would have to go through and fix errors. But once you get into a digital format like a Google Doc, make a copy of that and then start cutting from the copied document. The reason it's important to have a full unabridged text is that if later in the year you are trying to pull words from the text and you're oh, I need this specific word, is it in the piece? You can just do a Control F and see is that word in the piece. That's just a nice friendly tip that is always good to have, because if you start cutting your piece and now you don't have the full version, you're out of luck unless you want to copy down the text version again. So I just figured I'd say that before we actually get into the cutting process. So now let's start discussing what cutting actually is. So obviously we already talked about it's getting the piece within time, but there's a process behind it, right? Because since we have so much to cut, we definitely have to be careful with it. And the first part is going to be chunking. The basic idea behind chunking is that we want to start outlining what story we want to tell and getting it down to the base ideas and the base scenes. So we talked about last time the shape of the story, and that's going to be the first thing that we need to look at, because we need to make sure that we get what scenes are necessary to hitting those basic ideas and getting that little mountain type shape of our story. So the first thing is to identify the conflict and the climax. because obviously conflict is the type of story we're telling, and the climax is what we're going to be building up to the entire piece. Because once we hit the climax, there's not going to be a whole lot more time to like do following action and resolution. Generally, those are super short. So if we can keep what our climax is in mind, then we're going to be pretty well set up for the rest of the piece. So once you have identified your climax, then you need to go through and say, what is important to get us to this point? So let's use an example of a piece I'm doing right now. I'm performing Imaginary Harry. And the climax of the piece is he because the story's all about his imaginary friend and how his parents like don't really accept him for who he is and they like call him special. So the climax of our piece is a bunch of like he has imaginations of like his parents coming in and calling him special a whole bunch, and he gets like really upset. And then like he overcomes that and he like starts to believe in himself for the first time. That's the climax because there's the change where this big thing happens and it causes him to start believing in himself. So up to that point, we build up to this idea that he doesn't believe in himself and that his parents are mean to him and that his imaginary friend supports him and so on and so forth. All these different things that are leading up to this big like conflict and climax that is about to happen at the end, which is what the piece is truly about. So that's generally what you should be doing with the chunking process. First, you want to identify these essential parts, and then you want to start cutting it down to just those ideas. So once we have determined what scenes we need to have and how like many of them we're going to need and cutting out the fluff, we can then start whittling down those scenes themselves. This is going to be generally like one of the worst parts of the cutting process because you're gonna have to start like getting rid of things that you don't want to get rid of and that you love so much, but it's simply necessary. Because whenever you start the cutting process, at first you're going to be doing things such as cutting out like whole lines that are unimportant, or like whatever like big chunks of text within a scene are just completely like unessential for the type of story you're going towards. But you're eventually going to have to start making smaller and smaller cuts. Sometimes it can literally just be a couple words that'll save you a couple seconds, but eventually you're going to have to start coming to terms with what you actually need in the piece and maybe like cutting out some of your favorite jokes or some of the most impactful lines because simply you have to make room for the more important stuff, which is definitely where like cutting is the worst. Beyond that, whenever you are cutting, you obviously want to like keep in mind what your end goal is for length. Most people think of 10 minutes and think that that's good enough, but generally you're going to want to say about 1,200 words, or more accurately, you should time yourself and get like at a most 8 minutes or 8:30. 8 minutes is definitely better, but the reason why you want to have that like extra buffer time is that whenever you actually perform the piece, it's going to be a lot slower because you'll maybe have like different characters that speak really slow, or whatever. But more importantly, you're going to have like blocking, and the actions you do are obviously going to take up time. Even if you do some of them like while you're still speaking, there are definitely going to be times when you're not actually like speaking and you're going to be doing actions, which means that you're going to like have obviously more time than what you're going to have when you're just giving the lines verbally. So if you just get yourself down for 10 minutes, once you get to the blocking, you're going to be way, way over time. I found that this is especially prevalent in Duo. Like when I did HI, it was not as big of an issue, but in Duo, it's like a lot more impactful. And I think that's because there's a lot more interactive blocking, obviously, since you have a partner. And that definitely changes like the actual way in which you're going to be blocking and how long it's going to take. So it's definitely important to take that note if you're doing Duo itself. But otherwise, there's really not too much to say about this cutting process. Throughout it all, you're going to be wanting to go through and just trying to get it down as close to that 8-minute mark as you can, or even a little bit below, and start shaping the story that you want to tell. But beyond that, it's just really practice and going through and determining what you need and what you don't and getting it down to that point. And the best thing about cutting is that it's definitely not resolute. It can feel like it is because you have once you get your piece cut, you think that that's kind of it. But from that point forward, you can go through and you can recut your piece and make it better and add things back in and cut other things out So it's definitely not the end of the world if your cutting isn't perfect and that you're not super happy with it, because you're definitely going to perfect it over time. So there's nothing really more to say except for to go out and get started on that cutting and start getting it down. But as always, I hope this video was educational. I wish you good luck.